Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, Anjum, ko Louise Humpage, taku ingoa. So I'm Louise Humpage, the discipline convener of women's, not doing very well today, am I? Of gender studies, which is a small but dynamic cross-university discipline at the University of Auckland. And we explore issues of gender, sexuality, queer and trans theory, masculinity, and many other related topics. So it's my great privilege to have co-organised this series with Liz Hosking and Anne-Marie Parsons from Campus Life. And we're very grateful to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic who has funded the series. And what the series involves is, as you can see on the slide at the moment, 6 lectures that were supposed to be consecutive 6 weeks in a row. And COVID got to us. So we've managed to have 3 already, and Anjum today will be the 4th. And we plan, hopefully, to have the final 2 as live lectures. If that doesn't work out, then we will certainly be able to have Nicola Gavy's lecture at the bottom there by webinar, but Kira's lecture will be cancelled because she doesn't think that can be run in a kind of webinar format. We've got a range of lectures, but I do want to acknowledge that gender intersects in a range of differing ways with different identities, and the experiences of some communities, some groups are not being reflected in this lecture this series of 6 lectures. So I'd encourage anybody who's listening, if you're interested, to email me to get on the Gender Studies seminar series list. We have a weekly newsletter with lots of events, sometimes jobs, funding, a range of things. So if you're interested in hearing more across the year, then please do email me. Without further ado, it's a special pleasure to introduce our 4th speaker, Anjum Rahman, who is a political and human rights activist who sits on the boards of Sharma Hamilton Ethnic Women's Centre, the Waikato Community Broadcasting Charitable Trust, the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand, and the Ethnic New Zealand Trust. Now, if that wasn't enough, she's also worked in the prevention of sexual violence as a founding member of the Hamilton Campaign for Consent and through her work with ACC. Indeed, she became a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2019 as a result and was recognition of all of that work she has done for ethnic communities and for women. Now, I was just kind of telling Anjum I've been very keen to meet her because she's actually a little bit of a hero of mine. And I was aware of her work before March 15 last year when the terror attack occurred in Christchurch. But actually it was her response, as well as many other people in the Muslim community, but her response that really made me go, yes, we need more people like this in New Zealand. So the very kind of calm yet firm response saying, actually, we are not surprised about this. We have been telling you that something like this has been coming for a long time, and you need to better listen to organisations or communities like ours. And that really challenged the dominant view that, this is not us, that New Zealanders are, all wonderful and this particular person was somehow just an anomaly. And rather than just complaining about, what wasn't done, Anjum has actually gone on to initiate the Inclusive Aotearoa Collective that aims to combat discrimination. So ngā mihi nui, Anjum, for all of that hard work that's already gone. And we really look forward to hearing today about perhaps some future ideas about what we can do and how we can kind of contribute. So thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Anjum Rahman tuku ingoa. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Mana Whenua, and of course this is online, but given that it's hosted by the University of Auckland, I would like to acknowledge the Mana Whenua Tamaki Makaurau. I'm sitting here in the Waikato, so I'll also acknowledge King Tuheitia and the Kingitanga. I would begin with the whakatauki, which is one that we have on the Inclusive Aotearoa Collective Tahunu website, which is Ehara takutoa I te toa takitahi te toa takitini, which is my strength is not as an individual but as a collective. it's hard to know where to start with something like this, but I'm a person who grew up in Kiriroa, Hamilton, and being the only Indian girl in a primary school of around 500, and a real struggle with my own identity that wasn't probably solved until, I don't know, late in my 40s, I think. But when I think about a lot of the messages and messaging that and debates that we had growing up from those times in the 70s and 80s and so on. So we had the whole girls can do anything, which was a big push in the 80s. I remember when I was in school, but then that kind of moved to girls can do anything but shouldn't have to do everything, which was quite relevant in terms of the pressures that women were facing. I remember back in the day when we had all those debates about quality time versus quantity time with your children, and all those arguments between women who were in paid employment versus what was then called stay-at-home mums. There were all the debates around access to leadership and decision-making, particularly through representative governance, so Parliament, MMP, but also within business leadership. There was all the debate and work around sexual harassment and abuse, and rape culture, which, I recall being involved in a lot of that in the 2000s, particularly as blogging took off, and earlier this decade, and then more recently debates around equity versus equality, and the whole issue of merit-based arguments as a means of continuing to keep people out. And so, this nonsense that everyone can compete equally, that it's a level playing field, and that the most competent get to the top, which just happens to be Pākehā men time and time again, as if the decisions about what is meritorious aren't culturally laden, and as if skills aren't defined in a way as to exclude others. So the question for me, the initial question is, who holds the answers for women's empowerment? And we have these really strong narratives of who it is that is liberated. And certainly we have had a lot of wins in New Zealand. There's been some success and struggles for representation, the ability to access the workforce, to access more health equity, to access media, women being able to hold their own bank accounts, being in political leadership. But when we drill down into some of those numbers and you look at who is getting access to the workforce and to well-paying jobs, and for so many women of colour, their jobs are still the lowest paid ones, the least organised, with the least protections. And I wanted to kind of start by looking at a few things that highlight some of the disparities. And I looked at MPs, and I looked at who was the first MP in a particular category, but then I also looked at who was the second and the gap between those. And I thought that tells a strong story. So the first woman MP in New Zealand was elected in 1933, and the second in 1938. The first Maori woman MP was selected in 1949, and the second not till 1967. The first Asian woman MP was elected in 1996, and the second one in 2008. And the first Pacifica woman MP was not elected until 1999, and the second one in 2008. So, and we've had 3 women prime ministers, not yet had a single person of colour as a prime minister. And, we had the first Maori mayor in 1960. And I contacted Deborah James, who used to work at council, to see if she could get me some figures. So I'm just going to share, just bear with me, some figures around local government representation. And so if we look at the proportion of Maori elected members there, sort of was getting it above the 5%, and then had a dip, and then it has been getting better, so up to 10%, which is still not enough, but it's at least improving. And then when we look at other ethnicities, And obviously these numbers, absolute numbers, are not going to add to 100 because people identify with multiple ethnicities, as it should be. But you look at that gap there, and it's a huge gap in the Asian and Pacific space, and then we're not sure what those other ethnicity are. But yeah, I felt like that did tell a story in itself. And you know, the other things, like we talk a lot about the gender pay gap, and I think it's really visible and it's still a thing. But what about the ethnic pay gap? That's something that we're actually only just starting to talk about, and it is not looking good. So let me just, I promise you there's not going to be too much of these graphs and things, but I thought we should look at a few. Hang on, getting confused with my buttons here. So I'll share the screen again. So this is looking at just the public service ethnic pay gaps, and you can see how that's going. So the percentage pay gap for Māori, and this is men and women, finally took a bit of a drop in 2009. It did have a bit of a drop there in 2014 and back up again. The Asian pay gap has kind of just been growing and stable in 2019, but well, look at where that Pacifica pay gap is at. Was growing, finally took a bit of a hit in 2019. But to me, this is one that's telling a really big story. So there, that blue line up there being the Pakeha men, and then the light blue line being Pakeha women. And look at what's happening to that green line with Māori men, who started off, at least at this point, 1997, being sort of equivalent to Pakeha men, and look at where they are now. Look at that gap. And Pacifica women, as we have known, have always been at the bottom, and that gap is widening. And the gap between Pakeha men and women doesn't seem to be having any dents much in it there either. But yeah, so looking at the fact that Pacifica men and Māori men are actually earning less than Pakeha women. And what does that mean? What does that mean for our activism? What does it mean for our feminism? And what are we doing about it? So yeah, and the reason why I kind of brought those up is because we tell ourselves these narratives about how well we're doing or not doing, and you know, it's interesting that that narrative isn't actually true for all women within the society. And I picked up something from remnet.org.nz where this woman of colour, she talked about, she asked the membership and only got a response from 14 companies, so that's not a huge sample size. But even so, what that response gave her was that only 36% analysed pay gaps by factors other than gender. And surprisingly, only one organisation analyses it by ethnicity. And perhaps more alarmingly, she says only 21% of member organisations indicated that they'll look at analysis by ethnicity in the future. So not even going to look at it for the majority of people. And it's really interesting, the strong resistance to measuring ethnicity. And a large part of me is wondering whether that's because people don't actually want to know about and see these inequities. And we know that ethnicity is not an easy thing to measure, and as I mentioned, people may have multiple ethnicities and identify equally with more than one, but there's just this whole notion of why can't we all just be New Zealanders? Why do we have to tick these things on these forms? And my answer to that really is we can, when those inequities have been removed. And when the cultural dominance of one group has been removed, then we can say, yes, we are all New Zealanders. But right now, if we don't measure those inequities, then we can't actually all be New Zealanders. And, you know, what I come across a lot is this notion that Pākehā women have solved liberation and equality for women. And what we get so much, and Muslims have to hear this all the time, but others do too, is that we treat women as equals here. And following from that, this notion that therefore we're the holders of knowledge and wisdom, and that, you know, also that notion of having a responsibility to save other women who are less fortunate than themselves, which feels good and noble, and, you know, therefore is actually sometimes a hard notion to challenge. But actually it's been a predominant narrative for centuries. And if you look back to the history of colonization and this notion of savages and the white man's burden and so on, and this is the narrative that we've had, and particularly around Muslim women, as if we need to be saved, as if we have no agency, or we aren't able to do things for ourselves. And it's interesting, and I could do a whole separate lecture on this, but unfortunately cannot. But you know, the first university in the world was founded in Morocco in 1895 CE, and was founded by a Muslim woman. And, you know, we've had a history of strong Muslim women scholarship, of Muslim women as, you know, Aisha, who's a renowned figure in early Muslim history, who was a scholar in medicine, law, mathematics. She gave rulings. She was a teacher, and she was a teacher of both men and women. She led led an army into battle. But yeah, I mean, we have Muslim women throughout history as warriors, as leaders, and we find that often that narrative is suppressed by Muslim men, and often that isn't a matter of faith, but it's about power and control, as is, you know, all of patriarchal narratives. But these stories are definitely absent in the wider discourse, and which, you know, reinforces the fact that we're seen as powerless victims with no voice or agency. And what is the impact of this? And for me, like, one of the things that is really, you know, I just can't get over it really, is the way that, for example, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were so much supported through a feminist narrative and through the empowerment and freedom, you know, the notion that we were freeing women, and that was such a large part of the justification. So I'm just going to quote to you. So I have all these links which I can make available if people want them, but I'm quoting from one article that I found which says, here are the facts. After the invasion of Afghanistan, that is, Americans received reports that the newly liberated women had cast off their burqas and gone back to work. Those reports were myth-making and propaganda. Aside from a small number of women in Kabul, life for Afghan women since the fall of the Taliban has remained the same or become much worse. Now, this was written in 2008. Under the Taliban, women were confined to their homes. They were not allowed to work or educate themselves. They were poor and without rights. They had no access to clean water or medical care, and they were forced into marriages, often as children. Today, which is in 2008, women in the vast majority of Afghanistan live in precisely the same conditions, with one notable difference. They are surrounded by war. The conflict outside their doorstep endangers their lives and those of their family members. It does nothing to bring them rights in the household or in public, and it confines them even further to the prison of their own homes. Military escalation is just going to bring more tragedy to the women of Afghanistan. And then from a different article, so Marit, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce this correctly, Nybakk was then the chair of the Norwegian Parliament Standing Committee on Defence, and she made this statement: "This is a war of liberation and also a war to liberate Afghanistan's women. So the aspect of women's rights is crucial for me. For many years, I've been greatly concerned about the extreme oppression of women under Taliban rule. Here in the West, we close our eyes to the grotesque treatment women are subjected to because it does not affect us. But that war was never a liberation. And so Berit von der Lippe says later in that article, suddenly we saw that very powerful people were taking it upon themselves to speak on behalf of Afghan women. And she's said that she was inspired by the US professor of rhetoric, Cheryl Glenn, who is known for her concept on the rhetoric of silence, in which she links silence with power. Classic rhetoric is mainly concerned with what is said, what is written, and how this is done. But we can learn a great deal by studying silence, that is, what is not said and who does not speak and why they are silent. And the voices that we did not hear in autumn 2001 were those of the Afghan women. As we all know, their silence was not their choice. It was as a result of local as well as global power relations. Therefore, it was easy for Western women to portray themselves as the ones who gave Afghan women a voice. Laura Bush and other Western women took the opportunity to speak on their behalf and tell the world what the Afghan women wanted and needed. And the Iraq War was a similar situation where we were getting these narratives of, that Iraqi women will be now free to wear miniskirts and they were liberated and so on. And you only need to look at the situation in Iraq today and the rise of ISIS and what's been going on there. And that is not liberation. And this notion that these women would have white women speaking for them as if they couldn't speak for themselves. And for me, it really is then about what space are you making so that the voices of women of colour are heard louder than yours. I mean, can we not be our own salvation? And can there be times where you don't centre yourselves, but that we get to centre ourselves? We have a similar issues with burqa bans and hijab bans. And I'm just going to quote from Sarah Down, who wrote in the Canterbury Law Review in 2011. To take just a few examples of when this claim has been made, and this is around the claim of the fact that the laws banning burqas and banning hijabs were liberating of Muslim women. So when this claim has been made, the Speaker of the French Parliament, Bernard Accoyer, has said the full veil is, quote, the symbol of the repression of women. Meanwhile, French President Nicolas Sarkozy has argued that the burqa is a sign of subservience and therefore banning it is a question of freedom and of women's dignity. Echoing this sentiment, Spain's Justice Minister Francisco Camano argued that garments such as the burqa are hardly compatible with human dignity. In a similar vein, an Austrian minister has stated that the burqa symbolises the submission of women. And these avowed statements of concern for women have been so uniform so as to prompt one commentator to contend that when it comes to burqas, everyone, it would seem, is a feminist. Numerous Western feminists have welcomed these statements of their leaders' avowed commitment to sexual equality and have agreed with the representation of the burqa is inherently oppressive against women. Accordingly, Western women concerned with women's rights have been amongst the most ardent proponents of a ban of the burqa. And I find it quite interesting that while you have this narrative of wanting to save Muslim women from oppression in their own countries, there isn't that notion to save them in Western countries. So you don't feel like saving us from laws that dictate what we can or can't wear. You don't feel like saving Maori or Pacifica women in this country. Do Australian feminists feel like saving Indigenous Australians? Obviously, a few of them or some of them might, but the majority narrative seems to be that they aren't. But even beyond that, I mean, women of colour don't want or need to be saved. What we want is to be recognised, and we need Pākehā women to move aside and make space, just like we want men to make space for women at the top table. You know, we then have to ask, what space are white women making for women of colour? And it's really interesting. I was just listening and fuming at this interview that I heard on Radio New Zealand, and it was about Muslim women and sports and access to sports. And so in the interview, there was the lead researcher, who was a white woman. There was a Muslim woman who was quite apparently not the lead researcher, and then another young Muslim woman who was speaking to her involvement in sports or not. And literally the white woman spoke equal to or more than the other two Muslim women. And I have no doubts that her intentions are good. But you would think that this would be one area where Muslim women could speak with authority and where they could be at the forefront, right? And they weren't. And there could be many factors in that. They could have a lack of confidence with English or a lack of media experience, nervousness, all those sorts of things. But those things could have been addressed prior to the interview. And, you know, and that's another point that I want to make around research in general, which really frustrates me, is that there's already issues around employment and access to employment and access to well-paid employment for women of colour. But even in the areas which should be our own, you know, or should be a space where we could shine or excel or hold some level of power, we don't. And so what we're often finding is that we are the subjects and objects of research by white people, and that all the funding, not all the funding, but a lot of the funding in ethnic spaces or Maori spaces or Pacifica spaces is taken by white people. And we've just heard, you know, I've been hearing about that in the last couple of months, where Maori people are coming forward to say, why can we not be the lead researchers on aspects that relate to Maori? And there's issues of cultural appropriation, there's issues of racism. Like, you know, how many women of colour are actually professors at our universities at the moment? I didn't have time to look at the data there, but it speaks to, if the white people keep getting the funding and the resources and they keep getting the promotions based on research on us, how is that even fair? I don't think it is. Excuse me. And then if we look at, you know, I look back at some examples of the feminist debates that we'd have in the past around, you know, porphyry, and where women sit at the back or women don't speak on the marae, and the level of cultural superiority that was brought to these debates, where white feminism was seen as the battler for equality and Maori women seen as being oppressed by their own culture. And again, the silence or not having the same media voice or the same voice in areas where decisions are being made to challenge some of that. And I recall, you know, that Maori exhibit once in our National Museum, Te Papa, which was displayed on the condition that menstruating women should refrain from viewing it. And just the level of outrage and the, you know, the notions of inequality and the total loss of voice of Maori women to be able to push back and say what they actually thought or felt about it. And I'm not going to speak for them, you know, it's not my place to do that, but I felt like I didn't hear enough from them at all in the public discourse. And I had to go looking for places where I could hear what they were saying, which weren't mainstream media. And that is not good enough. I mean, the fact is that white supremacy never went away, and we have never solved racism. And just because something makes you uncomfortable or offends your notions of what equality or empowerment should be, doesn't mean that you get to rush in to judge and to speak for women of colour. And so for Muslim women, the stereotypes that we're dealing with, that we are submissive, that we're not assertive, that we are therefore unable to lead, that we're brainwashed, that we have a lack of critical thinking, which is why we wear these hijabs or burqas, which are impressive on us. It impacts our ability to get employment, for which I'd refer to research done by Dr. Edwina Pio. It has financial impacts, which then leads to impact on health, on poor housing, on access to education, on social mobility. And, you know, it's like I feel like we aren't addressing all of these things at all. I don't see them addressed adequately. And I know, you know, for a lot of people, maybe you are trying to be inclusive, but the question is, how much are you willing to change? And how much are you willing to pull down power structures? And what we saw in the US, which I've mentioned in other speeches, you know, that 52% of white women voted for Trump. And inevitably, we will see that a lot of white women will stand alongside white men before they will stand alongside people of colour. And so representation is important, you know, and it's a right. Like, we have the right to be represented and to be in spaces, but it's not enough, because you can't expect to bring people into a structure that marginalises them and then put the burden on them to change it, all the while that the others are working actively against those people to prevent that change. And that's what we're seeing time and again. So the question is, are you willing to be challenged? And again, I'd refer to the book White Women's Tears by Ruby Hamad, which gives a really straight breakdown of the reaction of people being challenged on racism. So you get tone policing, you get defensiveness, and I've been a person who's been challenged. I had my own experiences of being challenged, and I think back to some of those debates that we had on the Hand Mirror, which was that feminist blog back in the day, and around trans people, and sometimes around disability issues. And I know that there are spaces I need to improve, and if I'm not doing it right, I need to make sure that the people around me can feel that they're able to tell me so in no uncertain terms, and that I'm able to listen with humility and think about how I can adjust. And that I actually, instead of complaining or feeling hurt or feeling defensive, that I actually thank those people for being willing to share with me, because that is work on their part, and that is an effort they had to make because I was ignorant. And the thing is, we can't all be experts on everything. Therefore, what we have to be is prepared to be open and willing to adapt. And the thing is, as Muslim women, we have so many battles that we have to fight for: adequate spaces in our mosque, access to leadership within the community, access to funding, the way religious texts are interpreted, discrimination within our own community. So yes, the Muslim community in New Zealand is hugely multicultural. I mean, our mosque in Hamilton has 42 different ethnicities, and in some communities it's more than that. And there are strong elements of racism within that to be addressed, as well as other forms of discrimination. But how can we do that when our time is taken up fighting for our right to exist and to access mainstream services, to access employment, to access physical health and education? We know that Muslim women are facing discrimination all the time because they approach us, and what they're dealing with is from physical and verbal abuse to exclusion, dealing with accusations and stereotypes. And when I think of my own time since 15th March, you know, and even prior to that, having meetings with Department of Internal Affairs, Office of Ethnic Communities, New Zealand Police, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Human Rights Commission, Immigration New Zealand, and other women dealing also with Ministry of Education and others, then dealing with the Royal Commission of Inquiry. The media work just takes hours, and it's all unpaid, as well as Christchurch Core Advisory Network and work around hate speech. I mean, and so personally, and when I look at the other women in leadership positions, what we haven't had time for is developing the next level of leadership, adequate programming for our women, and actually advocating within the community as we would like to do. So I want to finish off with some solutions. And so the project that I'm working on, Inclusive Aotearoa Collective Tāhono, we're having conversations across the country on belonging and inclusion, a little bit hampered by COVID, but we've been doing stuff online as well as in person as we can do it. Because and the reason that we're working on this project is because we know that the answer to hate is not a quick fix, and there are a lot of people doing great stuff, such as, you know, if you look Alison Mao and Me Too NZ and with Kirsty Johnston and a few others. And as an aside, supporting our women journalists and sharing them on social media and taking the time to drop in a positive comment. And if you have energy to speak back to some of the negative ones and report the really abusive ones is a good way to do activism. But yeah, we are having these 90-minute conversations and we're looking at the broadest view of diversity. So it's not just cultural, ethnic, all kinds of diversity, including socioeconomic, people with disabilities, gender diverse, all of the things. And we're going to have some Zoom conversations coming up. So feel free to head on to our Facebook page or website if you want to get involved. From that, we're looking to develop a strategy for belonging and inclusion, and then looking at implementing that through collective action. And believe me, we are hearing some really heartbreaking stories from across the country. And finally, just hitting off on some things. You know, people always ask me, what is it that I can do? What can I do about this? So some thoughts on that. First of all, challenge your own assumptions and be open to a variety of viewpoints. So just because you read a book by Ayaan Hirsi Ali doesn't mean you know everything about Muslim women. She had some terrible experiences. She also has her own agenda to push. There is diversity within groups. There are a multiplicity of viewpoints. Don't just find the viewpoints that confirm your own biases about cultural superiority. And I've heard this from myself. I've heard women of colour stand in front of a white audience and say, you women are so lucky, you're liberated, you're not oppressed like us. I mean, you all have heard about internalised misogyny. There is also internalised racism, especially when people have been brought up in a culture of racism, or where the system is designed in such a way that they will only get funding and support if they give you the narrative that you want to hear. And sometimes that's why they do it. You need to make space and make room. If people aren't engaging with your organisation or your group, consider why. It could be socioeconomic factors that are barriers, it could be accessibility, it could be language. They might not be able to see a clear line between the efforts that they would make with your group and the results. They might fear or actually face being talked down to, or having that burden placed on them to be the ones that have to create the change. Maybe go to them, or maybe just work on your own spaces. Particularly stop asking them to continually volunteer for what should be paid for. Changing structures. Women know how to do this, and we've been pushing for decades. So whether it's in domestic violence legislation, whether it's rape and marriage, whether it's access to affordable childcare, whether it's equity policies, you've learned how to change patriarchal structures, though in some cases looks like we are moving a bit backwards. But now can you challenge yourselves as upholders of racist structures, ableist structures, transphobic structures? Are you prepared to challenge yourselves to change? And learning to challenge your own. Often they're not going to listen to us. So it's the same as having male allies for action on women's empowerments. What do you ask for from a male ally? You ask them to speak up when a friend or relative or colleague is making sexist jokes or disparaging remarks or poor decisions that are sexist. You expect them to play a part in dismantling rape culture. It shouldn't just be women's work, right? So then what is your work in challenging your own friends, colleagues and relatives? Because ultimately that hateful rhetoric is harming us, whether it's financially or physically or emotionally. Racism has a huge impact on mental health and well-being. Words lead to actions, whether it's being a punch or being yelled at or having a guy go into 2 mosques and kill people. Also, the stories that are told about us as continual victims tell us, we're being asked constantly, tell us again how you're being victimized, tell us again about how Muslim women are being oppressed, so that you can keep feeling sorry for us and keep putting us in that place where we need to be saved. We want you to start seeing our strength and beauty and our courage and our abilities and our humanity. We want you to start seeing us and outside of your own cultural prism. And finally, don't blame individuals when it's the systems, structures, policies, and exclusionary beliefs that are to blame. And so the best example that I can give of this was something that was told to me by a friend, where she's a Pākehā woman, and she had a colleague who was a woman of colour, and they had to ring around organisations and people for something. And so they divided it in half. And my friend, who was Pākehā, got through her list really quickly and easily. People were friendly. They gave out phone numbers of other people to contact. The other person, it was taking her ages. She couldn't get through. She wasn't getting responses, getting negative feedback. And so it looked like, on the face of it, that the other person is not good at that job. When the Pākehā woman picked up those organisations and rang them, got a very positive response. The only thing that was different was that one person had an accent that indicated that they were Asian, and the other person had a Kiwi accent. And so again, it goes to that thing about measuring merit, measuring how well someone's doing. If you can't see, or you don't recognise the racism in the way that thing is set up and how it's impacting performance, then the person who didn't get the job done will get penalised because it was their fault, because it's made to be an individual responsibility and an individual failure when it was actually a systemic and structural failure. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I really, really appreciate your time, Anjum, and for giving us your wise words, but also words that I think are like they challenge us without, without, I guess, blaming us in a way, which is always a good way to motivate people to make a change, to do something different. So I really, really appreciate your time. And thanks to everybody who's attended. It's always great to see that somebody has actually turned up on these webinars, and more importantly, that you've asked really stimulating questions. So thank you very much. And that is the end of our webinar today. Thank you. Goodbye.